The David L. Wagner Distinguished Lectureship Series in Humanistic Inquiry was established by the late David L. Wagner and his wife, Renee B. Adams. Professor Wagner was a true friend of the Newberry. After earning degrees at the University of Michigan and serving in the Navy, he taught medieval history at Northern Illinois University until his retirement in 2003. Professor Wagner's primary interest was in medieval philosophy and education, and he was motivated by asking an enduring question: what does it mean to be human? In 1987, David Wagner came to the Newberry to teach a graduate seminar on the 7 liberal arts in the Middle Ages, and he told us that that course was one of the highlights of his career. His wife, Renee Adams, who's watching this evening, is an accomplished artist who taught at Indiana University and whose works are in the collections of the Art Institute of Chicago, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Renwick Gallery of the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and the Newberry Library. We're deeply grateful to David and Renee for endowing this lectureship and for entrusting us with this legacy at the Newberry Library. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Jonathan Lear. Jonathan Lear is the inaugural holder of the distinguished David L. Wagner Lectureship in Humanistic Inquiry. We're honored to welcome him back to the Newberry Library for the 3rd and final lecture in this series. Professor Lear is the John U. Neff Distinguished Service Professor at the Committee on Social Thought and in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Chicago. He's also a practicing psychoanalyst. Since 2014, he's been the director of the Neubauer Collegium, a research institute that brings together scholars from the University of Chicago and around the world to explore problems of serious human concern. Professor Lear has published 12 books in philosophy, wrestling with philosophical understandings of the human psyche and with the ethical implications that flow from us being the kind of creatures we are. His work has ranged widely, from the philosophy of Aristotle to the work of Sigmund Freud, and from the worldviews of Native American tribal communities to exploring how irony and its contradictions are vital to our humanity. Tonight, he delivers the 3rd of 3 lectures in his series entitled Exemplars and the End of the World. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jonathan Lear. Thanks for being with us, Jonathan.
Well, thank you very much, Danny. Really honored to participate in an event sponsored by the Newberry Library. I think the Newberry Library is one of the, I'll be talking about the fine and the noble and the beautiful. I think it is one of the really fine, noble, beautiful institutions.
Thanks so much.
Made, really. And I want to thank Renee Adams and David Wagner, who made these lectures possible. So even before the coronavirus pandemic took over the world's attention, we were already preoccupied with climate change and ecological catastrophe, as well as the possible dissolution of the democratic political order. These threats are real, and we shall need to think hard and well in the hope of finding ways to alleviate them. It's no surprise then that our imaginations should come alive. It is this imaginative activity that I have been investigating in these lectures. In health, we imagine alternative possibilities. Our imaginations open up to the future, they recreate the past, and they enliven the present. These are virtues or excellences of the imagination. But we also know that imagination can get in our way, distort our vision, and insist that falsehoods are true. When it comes to imagination, there is such a thing as ill health. So what I am concerned with are real threats to the imagination as we face real threats coming from the world. In these lectures, I have been arguing that our concerns with the end of the world in the sense of catastrophe has interfered with our sense of the end of the world in the sense of purpose, the ideals and values that in healthy times inform human life and give us a sense of what life is all about. We experience disorientation, not only about the world, but about ourselves, what to take pride in, what to admire or commit to with confidence. And in the previous lectures, the first one was on ecological catastrophe, the second one was on transience. I argued that a sense of what is fine and noble and beautiful about human life can go missing. Fine, noble, beautiful. These are words that are used to translate what Aristotle called kalan. And it's curious, I've talked about this in the past, that we need 3 terms to translate Aristotle's one. And that raises the question, In addition to losing the capacity to hold on to the fine, the noble, and the beautiful, might we also be missing the capacity to name the capacity that we have lost? This next section is called Return to Priam. In this context, I want to return to the last great Trojan king, Priam. As you will remember, it is Priam's fate to witness the destruction of his own kingdom and to suffer indignities that would be unimaginable but for Homer. In particular, the killing of his beloved son Hector, the desecration of his body, and then going to beg Achilles for the body back. And I would guess that there are people in this Zoom audience who know these words by heart. Quote, I have endured what no one on earth has ever done before. I put to my lips the hands of the man who killed my son, unquote. I want to consider Priam as he makes an appearance at the beginning of Aristotle's Ethics. It is astonishing that Aristotle, his students, and we now, millennia later, can all draw on the same literary figure, Priam, as he is depicted in Homer's Iliad. For Aristotle, Priam is the exemplar of the noble person of high standing who had to suffer world catastrophe. Now, before the pandemic, I read this as an example of the tragic hero once riding so high and then brought so low by fate, but maintaining his dignity through it all. In short, I read it as a familiar trope. Now I read Aristotle as making an important point about the dynamic interplay between happiness and the kalan in human life. And I also read him as making an extraordinary use of an exemplar. For Aristotle, each animal species has its distinctive form of flourishing, but our form is at a different level altogether. Our form of flourishing is happiness, or eudaimonia. And therefore, Aristotle says, it makes perfect sense that we do not say that an ox, a horse, or any other animal whatsoever is happy. The reason he gives is that they have no capacity to participate in kalan activities, for they are insensitive to the fine, the noble, and the beautiful as such. This Aristotle says is the key to our happiness. The active exercise of our ability to recognize, delight in, be amazed by, and then emulate those exemplars of the kalan that we experience in life, as well as our success through practice in internalizing the kalan, so that we in our life activities shine forth with the kalan ourselves. And this is more than a necessary condition of our happiness. Appropriate responsiveness to, internalization of, and active participation in the kalan is what our happiness consists in. And yet, and this is a very important point that I now see in Aristotle, although we can be stripped of our happiness by extreme misfortune, as Priam was, Aristotle insists that nothing at all the external world can inflict on us, can altogether alienate us from the kalan once we have internalized it, that is, become virtuous. Terrible reversals of fortune may spoil what Aristotle calls a person's blessedness, but even in such case, as he puts it, quote, his nobility shines through. And that is why Aristotle thinks that while a virtuous person is vulnerable, like everyone, in extreme circumstances to unhappiness, he could never become wretched or perform base actions. So here in a nutshell is the complex relation between happiness and the kalan. Although achieving the kalan is constitutive of our happiness, and although extreme misfortune, like world catastrophe, can destroy our happiness, once the kalan has been achieved, nothing can completely destroy it in us. There is a kernel that remains inalienable. That's what Aristotle is teaching. Now, Aristotle's account of Priam is in plain view, of course, but I do not think the idea of this inalienable kernel of the kalan has received the attention it deserves in contemporary Aristotelian-inspired approaches to ethics, because they tend to focus on the resilience of the virtuous person, his or her ability to sustain happiness across a wide range of familiar worldly circumstances. But when the prospect of world catastrophe comes near, as it has done for us, the question of what if becomes more salient. It is in this context that Aristotle's rhetorical strategy comes more clearly into view. Aristotle says that his lectures are meant to make a practical difference. Thus, his aim with Priam as an exemplar is not as a specimen for theoretical examination of the high brought low. It is meant to be of practical benefit. Aristotle's intended audience are people who are already en route to virtue. These are people who, to some extent, maybe they're just beginning, have already experienced the wonder and delight of the Kalan, and as they've seen it in others around them. And they've taken their first steps through practice and emulation to internalize it in themselves. Thus, they ought to be able to experience the Kalan, maybe just up to a small point, and experience up to some level from, as we would put it, from the inside. So in the case we are considering, Aristotle, the teacher, is installing the exemplar Priam in his students, along with a certain way of taking up Priam in thought, a certain way of conceiving him, as they themselves consider how to live a virtuous life and what is their relationship, the students, to happiness in the Kalan. Students thus acquire from Aristotle's teaching the capacity to return to Priam again and again in thought and imagination throughout the course of their lives. Now, allow me to make an Aristotelian distinction between, on the one hand, Priam, the exemplar, who exists, as it were, sort of over there, perhaps in real history, but certainly as a figure in Homer's Iliad, in Aristotle's Ethics, and more generally as an available figure in our cultural inheritance. That's on the one hand. And now on the other hand, I want to talk about Priam as in the moment he comes alive in our imaginations, in the imagination and thought of we, in the moment of being on the receiving end of his exemplarity. Priam, as we are actively imagining him right now, that's the Priam I want us to think about. The first Priam, the one over there in real life or in literature, is what Aristotle would call a first level actuality. But when Priam really comes to life in our imaginations, when he is really having the effect of being the exemplar that he is, that is what Aristotle would call a second level actuality or activity. Priam as exemplar in his full activity is alive in the mind of the person, hopefully us right now, who are on the receiving end of his exemplarity. So instead of continuing to focus on what is going on with Priam, I want to focus on what is going on in Aristotle's audience when they receive Priam as an exemplar in their imagination. Normally, when we study Aristotle, we concentrate on his doctrines, what he believed. Here, I would like us to shift our attention to the manner of his teaching. And let us imagine that we are part of Aristotle's intended audience. Aristotle's teaching at this point triggers the experience of Priam in our thought and imagination. We imagine what a virtuous person might look like when living through extraordinary misfortune. And with Aristotle's help, we see the Kalan shining through. What I want to suggest is that Aristotle is not just teaching us something about Priam, he is instilling a capacity to invoke Priam as an exemplar in his audience, as a means of building confidence here and now in our own emerging powers with the Kalan. There is something about imagining the inalienability of the Kalan that rings true, and it in this way builds confidence in the present, in the robustness of the Kalan. It is precisely this sense of confidence in the Kalan that went missing in the examples I considered in the first two lectures. Thus, Aristotle's use of Priam as an exemplar provides a clue for contemporary Aristotelians, we who would like to develop ethical thought based on a satisfying conception of human flourishing, that is, the happiness of which we humans are capable. The challenge is to find a paradigm that not only exemplifies the Kalan, but instills confidence in its durability, even when the prospect of world catastrophe is salient. Let me say a word about my continued use of the term Kalan. My point is not nostalgic. I have no interest in going back to ancient Greece, whatever that means. Rather, I want to use the term to signal a gap that, for reasons we may not understand, we may not have the concept we need to think the thoughts we need to be able to understand our condition well. In her essay, Loss of Concepts, the philosopher Cora Diamond has argued that one aspect of growing up in unjust conditions is that people may lack the concepts with which to understand their situations and themselves. Each of the possible translations of Kalan seems problematic to me. Noble carries with it connotations of thousands of years of European exploiters, thugs, and dissolutes, giving meaning to the term by dressing up in furs and shiny rocks and calling themselves king and queen, and so on. I say good riddance to them. Beauty carries with it the sense of an aesthetic beauty detached from the ethical. And fine signifies something good, but is vague, and it doesn't pack the right kind of aspirational punch. The point of my continuing to use the Greek word kalan is that it signals that we do have a hunch, but that we do not yet know in sufficient detail what it is we are looking for. So the aim here is not to recover Aristotle's conception in the hope of returning to it. The society Aristotle inhabited was also unjust. And so one should suspect that his concept of the kalan was itself disfigured, with a connotation of nobility legitimizing an unjust social hierarchy. My stance is Platonic in spirit. We assume that both we and those from whom we might learn have been living in conditions of injustice which disfigure our attempts to understand what is good. In effect, this is what it means to be in the cave, as Plato described it. Still, we can get glimpses of a good direction to follow. So using the kalan as a signifier, not a fully developed concept, and turning to exemplars is, I think, a fruitful direction. The hope is we can understand better when we have discovered the right kind of exemplar and also figured out what's happening to us, the audience, when such an exemplar succeeds in exemplifying. So the next section is called Looking for the Right Kind of Exemplar. We are looking for an exemplar who can instill confidence in this kernel of inalienability of the kalan. And we would like to know how that works when it does work. And here I am indebted to the work of Linda Zagzebski on exemplars and moral theory. Though given my interests, I'm going to go in a different direction. She makes the important point that, quote, we are often more certain of the identities of exemplars than we are of any conceptual foundation. We are more certain that Confucius, Jesus, and Socrates are admirable than we are of claims about the good of pleasure or what human flourishing is. And in fact, she continues, we are more certain that they are admirable than we are of what is admirable about them. So this is, I think, a crucially important insight here, that we can be grabbed by the beauty, by the kalan of an exemplar before we understand in any detail what it is that's grabbing us. But I think Zagzebski's paradigms, Jesus, Confucius, and Socrates, I think they cloud this insight a bit. I'll explain why. So take Jesus, for example. Jesus is introduced to us typically through a cultural vehicle, the Christian Bible. The Gospels tell us a remarkable amount about what it is that makes Jesus so admirable. And for many whose introduction to Jesus occurred in the interpretively rich context of Sunday school, hearing stories, singing hymns, listening to sermons, the root of influence is the opposite of the one Zagzebski describes. They move from being impressed with what Jesus accomplished, and in particular what he taught, to being impressed with and struck with admiration for him. So the root is really from the story to the person rather than the person to the explanation of why I'm grabbed by this person. And I think there's another problem, as Kierkegaard poignantly pointed out, cultural vehicles can be put to the opposite use for which they're intended. Kierkegaard tried to get his neighbors to see that, what was called Christianity in his time, the Christianity they were living, was a sham. And though he may have used the Bible to work his way back to Jesus as exemplar, he also saw that in its general deployment in mid-19th century Denmark, the Christian Bible was being used to tranquilize the population into accepting a watered down, and he thought dangerously misleading version of Christianity. Kierkegaard called Christendom, that is the contemporary cultural formation of Christianity, he called it a dreadful illusion. And part of what he meant was that one could talk all one wanted about Jesus, of being struck by admiration, of wanting to learn from him. One could quote Bible passages, listen to or give sermons, and all of it would be contained in what he called this illusion. And that is what made Christendom a dreadful illusion, because it got in the way of actually being a Christian rather than helped. Now, it's beyond my competence to explain, and beyond this lecture, to explain the decline of a culture's ability to transmit exemplarity from one generation to another. But the mere fact that there can be such a decline, I think, gives us an important clue. By the time of Kierkegaard's Christendom, however it came about, there was a culture of priests and preachers, of professors and Sunday school teachers and commentators and journalists who were failing at their tasks to bring the exemplar to life for the larger community. That is, there was a widespread degeneration in local exemplars, the group of people whom the larger community expected to pass on to them what they needed to know, a group with whom the community was in direct contact. That group lost their own ability to make the exemplarity of the great exemplar, in this case Jesus, vivid. Their sermons and books and articles, the examples they set, had a deadening effect that was not recognized as such, until Kierkegaard comes along. And this points us to a priority in what I'm going to call our local exemplars, who I think are the first responders to our need for the experience of something higher and noble and beautiful, the needs of spirit, which I have been calling kalan. So there's reason to look for the local exemplar. And our question here, is not what is going wrong when things break down, but what is going right when a local exemplar succeeds in exemplifying to his local audience? What does this elementary case of exemplarity look like? So the next section is called A Local Hero. In the autumn of 4th grade, when I was 10 years old, I swore on the playground. Although I vividly remember what followed, I cannot directly remember what I said. The class was at recess in late morning. It was a gray day, and I am pretty confident I said, "God damn it." This is where my memory clicks in. A classmate overheard me, was upset, and ran over to tell the teacher. And Mr. McMahon turned around, and he started walking towards me. He was wearing a trench coat, belted in the middle. His hair was in a crew cut common among men at that time. He might have been a police detective on a television show. He came over, he looked me in the eyes, and he said in a low, calm voice, "We do not use profane language on the playground." He then turned around and walked away. That was it. Now, I have been thinking about this moment on and off ever since, and it's come back to me now as I try to think about confidence in the kalan. I would like to take a close look at the exemplarity of Mr. McMahon and ask what it consists in. Mr. McMahon's direct communication, as Kierkegaard would put it, was that I was not supposed to swear, and I certainly got that message. But I am here concerned not so much with his direct teaching as with what he exemplified, what Kierkegaard would have called his indirect communication. I shall isolate and discuss 5 moments. There they are. The enigmatic nugget, internal to understanding, generosity of interpretation, non-retaliation, the persuasive power of reality, and protecting the playground. First, the enigmatic nugget. I had never heard the word profane before. I knew that he was telling me not to use bad words on the playground, but I knew he was going to tell me that before he opened his mouth. But in the midst of his utterance, he enclosed an enigmatic nugget. What was he telling me not to do? What is a profane word? Something important was being said. It was being said to me, and I didn't know what it was, even though in some sense I did. One might think one could solve this problem of what profane meant by looking it up in the dictionary. I tried that, but that turned out to be the beginning, not the end of my inquiry. And the inquiry has moved in 2 directions. First, what did Mr. McMahon mean when he used that word? And second, what does profane mean anyway? These questions have become lifetime companions. It's not that there are no answers, it's rather that the answers never close the book on the questions. Profane is one side of a fundamental division, with sacred on the other side. And of course, the original home of this division is religious. But even within a secular context, one can glimpse, however obscurely, an important divide. Over there, on the other side, is something special and good. And while the profane is that which gets in the way and even spoils. But however clear one gets on this division and its cultural history, there is always an enigmatic sense that there's more to learn. And I think this shows us something important about the exemplar recipient dyad. If, in an Aristotelian spirit, we think of the exemplar, in this case, Mr. McMahon, as qua exemplar, a first-order actuality, then the second-order actuality is the activity of Mr. McMahon coming to life in the imagination and thought of the person who is on the receiving end. In this case, that's me. The second-level activity, namely in me, can go on long after the actual exemplar, in this case, Mr. McMahon, has left the playground. And the continuing activity of the exemplar is due, at least in part, to what I have been calling the enigmatic nugget. It was as though the word profane became an intriguing and irritating grain of sand inside my imaginary oyster. Now, in recent years, I have imagined Mr. McMahon in that moment after he spoke to me, when he turned around to go back to doing what he had been doing. What was he thinking in that moment? Perhaps nothing. Or maybe that it will be lunchtime soon. But I've also imagined him smiling to himself, indiscernible to the outside world, and thinking, I've given that little fellow something to think about for the rest of his life. I shall treat the next 2 features of local exemplars, generosity of interpretation and non-retaliation, together. If I had simply received a standard punishment, I suspect I would have forgotten about this moment long ago. But not only was Mr. McMahon using this strange word profane, it was in a context in which I was not going to get punished. That was surprising enough. But even more so, it was as though punishment was not what this encounter was about at all. But then what was it about? Socrates famously said that philosophy begins in wonder. This, for me, was a wondrous moment. Mr. McMahon saw me as someone for whom a simple statement was sufficient. That was his interpretive generosity. But the generosity was also uncannily apt. As Kierkegaard pointed out, Adam could not have understood what God was telling him not to do because he had not yet eaten from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Adam did not act because he was sinful. It was in the act that he sinned. Now, I had heard this expression, God damn it, circulating around my house in the background as my mother and father argued. So I was in an Adam-like position. I had an intuition that this expression was used to express negative feelings and perhaps a hazy sense of prohibition, but I did not know what it meant. What I had was a possibility for imitating my parents when I got angry. But I did not understand what I had said until after I had committed the act. So not only did I not understand what profane meant, I did not understand what I had said to provoke it. Nevertheless, I had done it. How does a teacher respond to this childish mixture of innocence and guilt? I think this was a moment of creativity. Our drama did not have to play out according to a fixed pattern. Mr. McMahon saw me as a person I had not yet become, a person who needed no more than the words he spoke. And in his saying, I took up that possibility. And I think this is the nub of my gratitude. And as for non-retaliation, it has become a life lesson. Retribution in the name of justice rarely restores harmony. Non-retaliation is a centrally important trait, both in a teacher and in a psychoanalyst, and I think in a parent. But in terms of understanding the role of an exemplar, there are 2 points. First, I do not think I could have learned the lesson that Mr. McMahon taught me via direct communication, by someone just telling me that retaliation is bad. It had to be via exemplification. I needed to be on the receiving end. And second, the power of the exemplar lies not so much in the exemplar per se, but in this dyad that stretches out over space and time, that includes the exemplar and the person who is on the receiving end of this exemplifying experience. And the dyad instantiates a structure of repetition that I'm going to elucidate in the rest of this lecture. On my side of the dyad, time and again, I am called back to non-retaliation as a good way to be. And it has the structure of repetition that I outlined in the last lecture, the return of the good, again, perhaps this time better. It is through this repetition that non-retaliation has become established in me as an ego ideal. Not quite me. Non-retaliation is not entirely effortless and at my core, but me in the sense that non-retaliation is established as an ideal, as a project, as a task to which I aspire, in which I enjoy the moments I live up to. This life task set up in repetition remains somehow tied to the original exemplar. The next section is called the persuasive power of reality. Actuality demonstrates possibility. This is an important feature of exemplars which has not received the attention it deserves. So Zagzebski says that, quote, exemplars are not just good, they are supremely excellent, supremely admirable. Now, I'm not entirely sure what this means, and I certainly do not want to detract from the experiences of those who feel they have been influenced by exemplars of supreme excellence. But speaking in the context of my experience with a local exemplar, what mattered was not Mr. McMahon's supreme excellence, but the reality of the encounter. He was remarkable in that moment, but it is precisely because of his reality that there is much about Mr. McMahon I do not know and could not hope to know. That's what real experiences are like. Much happens that is beyond one's ken. But ironically, all this not knowing adds to, rather than subtracts from, my confidence about what I do know. All the aspects of not knowing are part of what it is to experience something as real. And in that way, actuality demonstrates possibility. It shows us that we are dealing with a real possibility, not just a wishful illusion of one. Of course, it is part of dealing with real-life circumstances that a widening context may change how things appear to us. An apparently good act with changing circumstance and in retrospect can come to have seemed, for example, manipulative. This too is part of real life. But it is precisely this hermeneutic openness and one's awareness that there is this openness that in other circumstances can add to one's confidence in the reality of the experience rather than detract from it. Again and again, I have been called back to the generosity of interpretation and of non-retaliation as ways to live. And those calls are tied to a kernel of the Kalan in Mr. McMahon. Now, was Mr. McMahon supremely excellent? I strongly doubt it. But I do not need or want to be persuaded of his supreme excellence. My confidence is grounded in the reality of what happened between us. The next section is called Protecting the Playground. In his act, Mr. McMahon established himself as a guardian of the playground. He excluded profane language from it, but he did not exclude me. But protecting playgrounds is not one more exemplary activity among others. I think broadly construed, playgrounds play a constitutive role in there being any exemplarity at all in human life. Insofar as ethical life depends upon exemplars, playgrounds lie at the heart of ethical life. In a nutshell, exemplars are meant to be played with. This is how the Kalan comes to light in our imaginations, and that requires safe playgrounds. I shall try to make this clear. The exemplar as a second-level activity is not a momentary act, but is better understood as a complex structure of repetition and return. And I think there are at least 4 levels here. First, in memory, we return to the exemplar and the actual moment. Of course, when imagination gets involved, there's room for distortion and outright mistakes, and I'll get to that. But memory itself is an intentional capacity. It's directed onto people and past events. It is a capacity to return to the actual past in memory. And in my case, I'm able to remember Mr. McMahon. I exercise a capacity to stay in touch with certain aspects of reality, the past. Part of what it is for me to do my thing as a human being is to stay in touch with the past, my past, in some way or other. Second, our imaginations get busy again. If exemplars are to play a role in our lives, they will do so by returning again and again in a recurring and yet unfolding elaboration. The imaginative re-engagement counts as play. The psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott made an extraordinary point about play, that it involves creating and maintaining, and what he puts it, an intermediate area of experience to which inner reality and external life both contribute. It's an area that is not challenged because no claim is made on its behalf, except that it shall exist as a resting place for the individual engaged in the perpetual human task of keeping inner and outer reality separated yet interrelated. Now, play is constituted by activity that Winnicott describes as resting from the everyday task of keeping subject and object distinct. It is imaginative activity in which the issue of whether it is just imagination or whether certain aspects are real recedes into the background. In terms of consolidating a sense of the Kalan, play has a way of washing out the impurities, at least for a moment. So when I go back to Mr. McMahon, I focus on his generosity of interpretation and non-retaliation. Who knows what else was going on with him? They are lost in the play. There is no doubt that the society we were both born into was in many ways unjust. Did he partake of the gender or racial stereotypes that were rampant at the time or not? These are questions that might well arise, and to good effect, when we are thinking through the complexity and nuance of the past. But they need not arise in play. And in play, the beauty of the exemplar is allowed to shine forth in some kind of isolation without the surrounding complexities of a wider world. And I think there's also room for a touch of magic. One further memory of Mr. McMahon, I will then stop, but one further memory, at the beginning of the school year, he told the class that this year we would learn the multiplication tables by heart. Soon, he told us, we would know that 7 times 7 equals 49, just like that. And as he said that, he snapped his fingers. I looked on in amazement. How could that come to be? And to this day, should I hear that 7 times 7 equals 49, I still feel a special pleasure. That's partly why I'm telling you about it. It is due to the particularity of Mr. McMahon and all of his contingencies, but the aspirations of non-retaliation and generosity of interpretation go together in me, along with a tinge of confidence that someday it will just come like snapping one's fingers and getting to 49. The third moment of repetition is the return from play to everyday life. And Winnicott tells us that play gives us a resting place from the perpetual human task of keeping inner and outer reality separated yet interrelated. But it is resting in the sense of restorative. We return from play energized and reanimated, precisely because the return is a return from the playground. It should be a rested and creative return. In the case of the local exemplar, the sense of the actuality of the actual event is enlivened, and the motivations that the exemplarity stirs up reaffirmed. As I said, in play, the kernel of the koan is isolated, but in returning from play to reality, the reality of that moment is reaffirmed. And in this sense, play is a nourishing activity for both inner and outer worlds. And the fourth and final moment of this repetition is the return of this whole threefold structure again throughout life. So consider the claim that playgrounds are for playing. That claim, playgrounds are for playing, can be read as an empty formalism, a tautology. But introduced by a local exemplar, in this case, Mr. McMahon, it has become an exemplary moment. There is unending novelty in the arising contemporary challenge, whether in a classroom, a psychoanalytic situation with family or friends. There's an arising novelty of how to maintain the playground. In this way, playgrounds are for playing becomes a life lesson. This is the repetition. Same again, perhaps next time better. Revision of Freud. So for Freud, the so-called compulsion to repeat lies at the core of neurotic life. Within the psychoanalytic situation, this shows up as transference, which is a projection onto the analyst of some ancient scene. For example, a past failure with a parent. Repetition within the psychoanalytic framework is the hallmark of being stuck. But from the perspective we have been developing, Freud's compulsion to repeat, as he puts it, is actually a failure of repetition. It's not a repetition. Transference is a failed repetition. And failed repetition is not one more species of repetition. It's a breakdown of repetition. It's a failure. And this isn't merely a matter of nomenclature that Freud called one thing repetition, and I am using the same word to name a different phenomenon. It is an issue of how we are to understand the relationship between sickness and health. Freud's conception of science allowed him to think that he could give a rigorous account of a pathological condition as though it were an isolatable condition. The issue of what health consisted in could be left in the background. And from this blinkered perspective, there is room to see neurotic repetition as there isn't any room, from this perspective, there's no room to see neurotic repetition as a failure of repetition because one doesn't have the clear view of what a healthy repetition is. But what we are in fact seeing in so-called neurotic repetition is the breakdown in repetition due to failure to find a good way to live with local exemplars, often parents, relatives, siblings, teachers, and friends, those important figures with whom we first engage in emotional and ethical life. It is an irony that properly understood, the aim of psychoanalytic technique is not to overcome repetition, but to restore it. And in a funny way, Freud says as much himself, and you can see this in the quotation here. In effect, I won't read it all out, but in effect, what Freud is saying is that we allow the compulsion to repeat into the analytic situation as though the analytic situation were a playground. We try to restore the ability to play with the repetition so as to make it a true repetition. So the task is to restore and sustain the playground in which a person's life with exemplars can return to genuine repetition. Return to Aristotle. So Aristotle does not spend much time discussing the inner world of the virtuous person, but I think his conception of ethical life is in the spirit of repetition. The virtues are themselves structures of repetition. Take courage, for instance. For the courageous person, everything that comes her way comes back to the courageous thing to do in the circumstances. Circumstances may vary widely, but however novel the challenges, the courageous person can always bring it back to repetition, the courageous response. But now, having worked through the role of local exemplars, the first responders, as I've called them, it seems to me that there is something missing in Aristotle's account of ethical education. He emphasizes that we are creatures who need to be inducted into ethical life via practices of habituation. But who is to do the habituating? At one level, it's obvious. It will be the parents and teachers and perhaps other culturally appropriate figures. But how? It can look as though nothing is missing. How does it work? By habituation. But how does habituation work? It seems to me that the answer must be by the exemplary work of local exemplars. Imagine a mean-spirited, selfish adult insisting that a child share over and over again, say with a sibling or a friend. It would not surprise us to learn that the child ends up habituated into a life of resentment and selfishness, not a life of generosity. So it can't be just doing the generous thing over and over again. It's got to be one that makes you generous. One needs the habituation process to have exemplarity built into it. And that is the way to capture the child's imagination with a glimpse of the Kalan in those who are teaching them. And I think this is a key moment in the transmission of the virtues from one generation to the next. This is not only a missing step in Aristotle's account of the acquisition of the virtues, it's crucial to understanding how his ethical teaching can have the efficacy it's supposed to have. For Aristotle's ethical teaching to make the right kind of difference, a practical difference, it needs to be introduced to students who have already been inducted into the virtues, at least to a certain extent. This means students need already to have had significant exposure to their own local exemplars. And this is the context in which Aristotle introduces Priam. Priam is, of course, already part of a shared cultural imaginary, so Priam enters our lives again as a repetition. But now he is to be put to a particular ethical use. He is invoked in the course of Aristotle's practical teaching. How does it work? In effect, Aristotle is asking his audience to imagine the end. And unlike our own contemporary imaginings of world catastrophes, which, as we saw, have rattled our confidence in our lives with ideals and values, Aristotle expects this imaginary exercise to make us stronger. Priam is introduced in the midst of a repetition. The entire ethical teaching of Aristotle is repetition, introduced to people whose psyches have already been shaped by innumerable repetitions in ethical life, stretching back to local exemplars and reaching forward imaginatively to the newness of repetition in an ethical life. It has puzzled some commentators how Aristotle's teaching could make a practical difference. Isn't he just adding a theoretical understanding to the good life that people are already living? The invocation of Priam shows that the development of self-conscious understanding in Aristotle's ethics involves more than the development of a theoretical grasp of what we already know. The point of introducing Priam into the community of exemplars is not to give the students instructions on how to behave when it comes to world catastrophe, but rather to consolidate the student's ego ideal now, with pride in the resilience of his own or her own imagining engagement with the Kalan. Priam is introduced to help us imagine the end well, not particularly to live through it. In effect, Priam is serving as a middle term, linking the two senses of end of the world that we have been tracking in these lectures. The end of the world is catastrophe, and the end of the world is aim or purpose of that which is really worth holding on to, even at the end of the world. It seems that this Priam element is what's gone missing in our contemporary attempts to imagine the end. In effect, Priam is introduced as the designated mourner for the death of his own culture. Troy is destroyed, its social norms and hierarchies are no more, the men have been killed, the women and children taken into slavery, and yet he, Priam, lives on to witness it all. But what is this designated mourner, Priam, doing in the imagination of Aristotle's students, those emerging into ethical life? I think he is stimulating the activity of anticipatory mourning. In imagination, Aristotle's students spend some time with Priam, a figure who, when he, Priam, was in his prime, things were going great, but who later lost everything that made life valuable and meaningful. Anticipatory mourning is a form of playing with the possibility of our own loss. If this imaginative exercise is to be part of our ethical education, we must return from this imaginative moment with a sense of plausibility. What we are concerned with here is the ethical education of people who have already, to some extent, had some experience of the Kalan. And for them, the sense of plausibility ought to come from it fitting in with their own experience thus far. That is, with their experience of their local exemplars, those who have introduced them to the virtues. In short, the imaginative exercise fits in with what they already feel they know. Only thus could the imaginative exercise contribute to building up confidence that they have indeed touched upon something real and durable in the Kalan. Though, as it goes with all exemplars, we may need the rest of our lives to figure out what all that means. So here's the last section called Mourning or Melancholia. In these lectures, I have been concerned with attempts to imagine the end of the world. And I have been inquiring into what counts as more or less healthy exercises of the imagination. I've tried to make clear that even if the threats of catastrophe of the world are real, and even if our imaginations are stimulated by these very real threats, that alone does not make our imaginings healthy. But then what does imaginative health consist in? I have come to think we should develop basic insights Freud laid down in his paper, Mourning and Melancholia, just over a century ago. Freud talks of melancholia as though he were diagnosing a disease, but he is really describing a fundamental mode of human being. As erotic and vulnerable creatures, one way we respond to loss or death, separation, disappointment, or betrayal is with furious identification. Strange as it may seem, in fantasy, we take in the very thing that has let us down, and then, as it were, berate ourselves for this loss. Or we leave it a bit vague as to who is the object of our fury. It is a spoiling activity, an attack on ourselves, an attack on the people and ideals that have let us down, and above all, an attack on the playground, which we might otherwise work through these losses. Our capacity to appreciate what is good or even kalan about others or ourselves goes missing. It's shut down by our own attacks. Mourning, too, is a response to loss, but with a significant difference. The paradigm of mourning is, of course, in response to the death of a loved one. But again, under Freud's influence, the concept opens out to cover a pervasive aspect of the human condition. our ever-recurring need to deal with separation and loss. Again, there is identification. In fantasy, we take in the lost loved one. But in marked contrast to melancholia, in mourning, the imaginative playground is preserved. There may be anger at the departed loved one, but not so much as to destroy the playing field of repetition. Our imaginations become active, going over our memories and feelings, our joys and disappointments, our sense of loss and resentment, and on occasion, our sense of the incredible specialness of it all. In imagination, we often distinguish good from bad. It is in this process that the exemplarity of the exemplar begins to shine forth. The other important difference about mourning is that it tends in the direction of a return to life. Thus, mourning is constitutive of the repetition that I have suggested characterizes human flourishing, and melancholia is an angry attack on the possibility of repetition. They are two fundamental modes of human being living in a world that is by nature not entirely up to us. So we are now living, of course, more than a century after Freud wrote his essay. And as I come to the close of these lectures, I have been living with the thought, what would I change about that essay? And here is my suggestion of the smallest change that would make the biggest difference. That we change the and in mourning and melancholia to an or. The and suggests the kind of diagnostic position of the psychologist, Freud, looking on these human conditions from a clinical distance. The or suggests that we are in the midst of it, that we are confronted by a choice between different modes of being, and it's not at all easy from the inside to tell just where we are or what to do. Mourning or melancholia is not a simple choice. It's not a matter of just deciding or exercising our will. As Freud and Plato and Aristotle taught us, much that goes on in our psychic formation eludes our conscious understandings and is certainly not subject to our will. But that does not mean we cannot become active with respect to shaping our lives and manners of being, that we cannot work in the direction of repetition. Precisely because we face such huge challenges to the continued existence of the world, we are simultaneously challenged to make healthy uses of our imaginations. These lectures are delivered in the spirit of thinking that the activity of repetition, the activity of making the unconscious conscious, may be of some benefit. So thank you very much.
And Jonathan, thank you so much. We appreciate it. You paint fantastic pictures here of your own state as a 10-year-old on the playground. I only wish you had actually included some slides of that as well. But thank you so much for this engaging talk that builds so well on the first two. And those, for those of you who are interested, those first two talks are accessible. One as a recording and one as a published paper, and you'll see those links in the Q&A. I think, unfortunately, we are at time now. So rather than take questions for Jonathan, I want to just thank you again deeply for your work, which was we had intended to be a series of 3 lectures very close together in time, but have spread out now from November 2019 to the present, and we've really benefited from your wisdom as the inaugural Wagner lecturer. So thank you for that.
Well, Danny, thank you for having me. I mean, who knew when we began it would be stretched out over this period, but it's been a real honor and a pleasure, and I've just been very grateful for the opportunity to have these thoughts and to share them with this group. So thank you very much. And
thanks. It's an honor for us as well. And again, I want to thank the late David L. Wagner and Renee Adams for supporting the David Wagner Distinguished Lectureship in Humanistic Inquiry here at the Newberry Library. A recording of this program will be available on the Newberry's YouTube channel in just a few days. Newberry programs like this remain free and open to the public thanks to the generosity of our donors. And during this critical time, we need the support of our entire community. Please support the Newberry Library by making a gift today. You can give online at www.newberry.org/give. And in recognition of National Library Week, which is this week, Some Newbery donors have generously agreed to match all gifts to our annual fund made between April 4th and April 10th. So if you give today, your gift will be matched 1-to-1. Thank you for considering that. We look forward to welcoming visitors back to events at the Newbery as soon as it's safe to do so. In the meantime, please join us on Monday, April 12th at 4 p.m. to virtually tour the exhibition Viva la Libertad, Forming More Perfect Unions Across the Americas, which explores the independent struggles of the Americas and reflects on their legacies today. I hope you'll also join us for a virtual program, Signs of Creative Resistance, Imagining Black Possibility in Chicago's Fifth City Movement, with Maida Teresa McNeil on Tuesday, April 13th at 5 p.m. You can register for these and other programs on our website, newbery.org. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.